Hello everyone. I know many of you listen while falling asleep. Before you drift off, leave a comment telling me where you're watching from. And don't forget to like and subscribe. Now, let's get comfortable, relax, and dive into tonight's case. There is a neighborhood on the west side of Los Angeles where the streets are wide, and the lawns are perfectly trimmed, and the houses sit back from the road with the quiet confidence of money that has been around long enough to stop announcing itself. The kind of neighborhood where kids grow up with everything they need, and most of what they want. Where summer afternoons stretch long and golden, and the worst thing that is supposed to happen is a party running a little too loud. A little too late, neighbors exchanging irritated glances over hedges the next morning. Cheviot Hills, Los Angeles, California. This is where our story begins, not in darkness, not in desperation, in sunshine, in wealth. In the ordinary, comfortable rhythm of a world that should have stayed ordinary, and didn't. It was the summer of 2000, and a young man who called himself Johnny Truelove was about to make a decision that would end one life, destroy several others, and set in motion a chain of consequences that would stretch across years, across courtrooms, across continents. His real name was Jesse James Hollywood. He was 20 years old, and by the end of that summer, he would be one of the most wanted fugitives in the state of California. But before we get there, before the desert hills, before the grave, before the boy who never came home, we have to understand the world that made Jesse Hollywood believe he could do what he did and simply walk away. Jesse James Hollywood grew up around the drug trade the way some kids grow up around their father's hardware store or their mother's restaurant. It was simply the business, the backdrop, the texture of daily life. His father, Jack Hollywood, moved in circles where marijuana was currency and transactions happened outside normal channels, and Jesse absorbed all of that early. By his late teens, he had built something of his own. A marijuana distribution operation on the west side of Los Angeles. Not cartel level, not cinematic, but real enough. Profitable enough. Enough to give a 20-year-old the dangerous feeling of being untouchable. And he had a name to go with it. Johnny Truelove. It was a persona as much as a nickname. An alias that carried weight in the circle of young men who surrounded him. Young men who wore the aesthetic of the streets while living lives of suburban comfort. Who talked about loyalty and respect and consequence with a conviction they had never actually been forced to test against reality. Around Jesse, the circle was tight. William Skidmore, known as Skid, a close friend since their school days. Jesse Rugg, charming and social, someone who could move easily between worlds. Graham Presley, younger than the rest, still finding where he fit. And others, peripheral figures who knew about the dealing, who enjoyed the parties and the money, and the reflected status of being associated with Johnny Truelove, without fully understanding what that association might one day demand from them. This was the world in the summer of 2000, easy, comfortable, built on the quiet assumption that nothing truly bad would ever arrive. That assumption was about to be destroyed. To understand it, you have to understand one other person, someone outside Jesse Hollywood's circle entirely. Someone who had done nothing wrong and had no idea that his name was about to become permanently tangled with one of the most disturbing cases in Los Angeles history. His name was Nicholas Markowitz. He was 15 years old. Nick was not a drug dealer, was not a runner, was not connected to Jesse Hollywood's world in any meaningful way. He was a teenager. A kid who liked music and skateboarding and had the easy, self-deprecating humor that comes from being smart enough to self-aware and young enough to still find the world mostly funny. He was loved. His mother Susan adored him. His father Jeff, his friends, people who knew Nick remember him as the kind of person who made a room feel lighter just by being in it. He had a brother, Ben Markowitz, several years older, and unlike Nick, Ben had made choices that placed him directly inside Jesse Hollywood's world. Ben owed Jesse money. Drug money. The figure that appears most consistently in the accounts of what followed is around $1,200. By any reasonable measure, especially for someone moving the volume Jesse Hollywood was moving, $1,200 should have meant nothing. Should have been a minor irritation, an annoying loose end, nothing more. But in the world Jesse Hollywood had built for himself, debts were never just about money. They were about respect. About what it meant for Johnny Truelove if someone could simply not pay and nothing happened. If word spread that you could cross Jesse Hollywood and walk away clean. He had gone to Ben multiple times. The money never came. And then Ben did something that pushed the situation past the point of a simple financial dispute. He vandalized the Hollywood family home. Windows broken. Property damage. A deliberate act that Jess could not absorb quietly without, in his mind, losing something essential about who he was and what his name meant. He needed to send a message. And in the decision that would define the rest of his life, Jesse Hollywood chose a method that he may have thought was clever. May have thought was controlled. May have genuinely believed was something he could manage and walk back from when it had served its purpose. He would take something from Ben Markowitz. August 6, 2000. A Sunday morning in West Hills, a neighborhood in the western San Fernando Valley. Nick Markowitz was walking down the street. Going somewhere or coming from somewhere, the aimless, unhurried movement of a teenager on a summer day when time is plentiful and there is nowhere urgent to be. Jesse Hollywood and several of his associates spotted him. They knew who he was. Ben's little brother. And in the logic Jesse had constructed, the logic of messages and leverage in making people understand what happened when they crossed Johnny Truelove, Nick represented an opportunity. Take him, hold him. Make Ben come to the table. Make him pay what he owed and undefine Jesse Hollywood cost. It was the logic of a game. A power game that Jesse had been playing for years, without ever once facing real consequences. What he did not reckon with, what he perhaps lacked the maturity or the moral seriousness to reckon with, was that Nick Markowitz was not a piece in a game. He was a 15-year-old child who had done nothing, who happened to share a last name with someone who owed Jesse money. Nick was forced into a vehicle. The crime that had just been committed was kidnapping, a federal crime. The kind of crime that doesn't stay contained. The kind of crime that, once committed, sets a chain of events into motion that has its own terrible momentum. Nick was gone. The clock had started, and Jesse Hollywood, 20 years old and already in over his head, had no real plan for what came next. What followed in the next several days is one of the most disturbing aspects of this entire case, not because of immediate violence, but because of what the absence of immediate violence revealed about the world these young men inhabited. Jesse Hollywood did not take Nick to a dark room. He did not immediately threaten him or chain him or make explicit what his fate would be. Instead, in a decision that reads as equal parts arrogance and stupidity, Jesse and his associates brought Nick along to social gatherings, to parties, backyard events, loose summer get-togethers, the kind of hazy casual scenes that existed constantly in their world, houses where people came and went, where marijuana circulated, where music played and no one asked too many questions. Nick was there, present, a 15-year-old boy sitting among people who were older than him, in a situation he had not chosen, in a world that was not his, and people knew. Some of the people at those gatherings understood that Nick had not come of his own free will, understood that something was wrong, and they said nothing, did nothing, because this was Johnny Truelove's world, and in that world you did not involve yourself in things that weren't your business. You looked the other way. You told yourself it wasn't your problem. This is one of the most haunting threads running through this entire case, the number of people who stood at the edges of what was happening and chose silence. Nick, for his part, adapted in the way that teenagers sometimes manage even in frightening circumstances. He talked to people. He smoked marijuana with some of the older teenagers at the gatherings. He laughed. On the surface, to people who didn't look closely, he might have seemed simply like a younger kid hanging around an older crowd. But he was not free. He was being held. And with each passing day the situation was growing more complicated, more dangerous, and harder to resolve without someone being seriously hurt. Jesse Hollywood was reaching that understanding, and in reaching it, he made contact with someone whose involvement would change everything. His name was Ryan Hoyt. Ryan Hoyt was not Jesse Hollywood's equal. He was not a close friend in the way that Roger Skidmore were. Ryan occupied a specific and diminished position in Jesse's world. He owed Jesse money, had been working off that debt through errands and tasks, through the kind of low-level servitude that exists in hierarchies built on money and fear. Ryan Hoyt was 20 years old. He was not strategic. He was not calculating. He was someone who had attached himself to Jesse Hollywood's orbit because that orbit offered belonging and money and status, and who had been paying for it ever since. When Jesse reached out to Ryan Hoyt in those critical days of August 2000, the message was not ambiguous. Nick Markowitz needed to be dealt with. The exact words exchanged, the precise nature of what was communicated, would be argued over in courtrooms for years afterward. But the outcome is not arguable. The outcome was real and documented and permanent. Ryan Hoyt drove to where Nick was being held. He had a TEF-E9 semi-automatic pistol, a weapon that Jesse Hollywood had provided, according to the prosecution's case. He took that weapon with him because the task required it. August 9, 2000. The Santa Ynez Valley sits above Santa Barbara, a landscape of rolling hills and oak trees and vineyards catching the last of the summer light. Beautiful country, quiet country. A place associated with weekend drives and wine tasting. Very far in spirit from Los Angeles, even though it is only a few hours north. Near an area called Lizard's Mouth, a rocky outcropping above the hills popular with hikers. A place where you could see far and be very alone. A grave had been dug. Nick Markowitz was made to get into it. Ryan Hoyt shot him 9 times. Nicholas Markowitz, 15 years old, died in that hole in the California hills, far from his home, far from his family, far from everything that had belonged to his life. He had been walking down a street 3 days earlier. He had been a teenager on a summer morning with nowhere particular to be. He should have had decades ahead of him. Should have grown up, become someone, lived the life that was waiting for him. He was murdered because his brother owed someone $1,200. That sentence is the center of this story. That fact is what you carry forward from here. The body of Nicholas Markowitz was discovered on August 11, 2000. Hikers found the disturbed earth, the signs of something terribly wrong, and authorities were called to the hills above Santa Barbara. The investigation moved quickly in some directions and agonizingly slowly in others. Quickly, because the social world in which the crime had occurred was not sealed. Too many people had been present at the edges of it. Too many had seen Nick at those gatherings, heard things, knew things. People who had chosen silence when Nick was alive now faced the reality of a murdered child and found silence much harder to maintain. Slowly in the direction of Jesse James Hollywood. Because by the time the investigation had gathered enough to move on the people responsible, one of those people was already gone. Jesse Hollywood had run. He had looked at what was coming and made the choice that had defined his entire short life. The choice that consequences could be avoided. That money and cleverness and the right connections could keep the worst outcomes from arriving. He fled California. Fled the United States entirely. And while his associates were arrested, while Ryan Hoyt was taken into custody and charged with first-degree murder, while the Markowitz family sat in courtrooms and heard testimony about what had been done to their son, Jesse James Hollywood was somewhere else, living, breathing. The hunt had begun. The arrests came in the weeks the discovery of Nick Markowitz's body, and they came with the kind of speed that happens when a crime has too many witnesses, too many loose edges, too many people who were present at the wrong moments, and now had to decide how much they were willing to protect the person who had put them there. Jesse Rudge was arrested. William Skidmore was arrested. Graham Presley was arrested. Others who had been at the gatherings, who had seen Nick, who had known something was wrong and said nothing. They faced their own legal reckonings in the months that followed. The web of people connected to what had happened to Nick Markowitz was wider than Jesse Hollywood may have imagined when he made the decision to take a 15-year hold off a street in West Hills on a Sunday morning. And Ryan Hoyt, who had driven into the hills above Santa Barbara with a TEF-E9 and dug a grave and shot a child 9 times, Ryan Hoyt was arrested and charged with first-degree murder with special circumstances. He did not take long to crack. Under interrogation, facing the weight of what he had done and the evidence that was already assembled against him, Ryan Hoyt gave investigators what they needed. He talked, and what he said pointed, clearly and directly, at the person who had given him the weapon and the order. Jesse James Hollywood. But Jesse James Hollywood was not there to be arrested, was not there to be questioned or confronted or led into a courtroom in handcuffs. By the time law enforcement was ready to move on him, he had already made himself disappear. The question of where he had gone would consume investigators for the next several years. Susan Markowitz learned that her son's body had been found in the hills above Santa Barbara, the way no parent should ever learn anything. The call came, the words came. And the world that had existed before that moment, the world where Nick was still possibly out there, still possibly findable, still possibly alive, closed forever. She had known something was wrong from the moment Nick disappeared. She had felt it the way mothers feel things, in the part of the body that sits below rational thought and simply knows. She had called police immediately when Nick didn't come home, had pushed and advocated and made noise, in the way that parents of missing children have to make noise, because the machinery of law enforcement does not always move at the speed that love demands. And now Nick was gone. And Susan Markowitz entered a grief that would reshape the rest of her life. Not into bitterness, though anyone would have understood bitterness, but into something fiercer and more purposeful. She would become one of the most visible and determined advocates for justice in her son's case. She would sit in courtrooms. She would face the people who had been present while her child was held and had done nothing to save him. She would give interviews and speak publicly and refuse, absolutely refuse, to let the world forget who Nicholas Markowitz had been. But before any of that could mean what it needed to mean, before the most responsible person could face what he had done, Jesse Hollywood had to be found, and finding him was proving to be very difficult. The FBI became involved in the search for Jesse James Hollywood relatively early. A case involving a kidnapping that crossed state lines, a murder, a fugitive who had clearly left California. This was exactly the kind of case that drew federal attention. Jesse's name went onto wanted lists. His photograph was circulated. His case was featured on television programs dedicated to profiling fugitives, the kind of programs that ran photographs and case summaries and asked the public to call a hotline if they recognized the face on their screen. People who had known Jesse Hollywood, who had been part of his world, were questioned. His father, Jack Hollywood, was investigated. The FBI examined whether Jack had helped his son flee, had provided money or connections or both. These questions would eventually have legal consequences of their own. But Jesse himself remained out of reach. In the immediate aftermath of Nick's murder, Jesse had not simply driven to the next state and laid low. He had moved with a purpose and a speed that suggested either very good planning or very good help, possibly both. He had left California, left the United States, and traveled to a destination that, in the early 2000s, offered a particular kind of shelter for American fugitives, Brazil. Specifically, he made his way to Saquarema, a coastal town in the state of Rio de Janeiro about 2 hours east of the city itself. A beach town. The kind of place where the pace of life is slow and the ocean is warm, and a young American man with money and a desire to disappear could, at that time, find a degree of anonymity that was difficult to achieve anywhere inside the United States. Brazil's extradition relationship with the United States had complications at that time that made it a destination some fugitives deliberately sought out. Whether Jesse Hollywood knew this from the start or discovered it along the way, he ended up there and he stayed. In Saquarema, Jesse James Hollywood built something that resembled an ordinary life. He gave himself a new name, Eduardo Lopes, a name that fit the landscape, that drew no attention, that allowed him to exist in a Brazilian beach community without the constant danger of someone connecting the face to the wanted and the facers circulating thousands of miles away. He lived with a local woman. He became a familiar presence in the community, known to the people around him as Eduardo. A young foreign man, friendly enough, seemingly comfortable, living quietly by the ocean in a town where nobody asked too many questions about where people came from or what they had left behind. From the outside, it might have looked like peace, but Jesse Hollywood was not at peace. Could not have been, not entirely, because the life he was living was a fiction built on top of a reality that had not gone away. Back in California, the trials were happening, the courtrooms were filling. The people who had been present at the edges of what he had done were standing before judges and answering for their roles in Nick Markowitz's kidnapping and death. And somewhere in Los Angeles, Susan Markowitz was sitting in those courtrooms, waiting for the day when the person most responsible would be made to do the same. Jesse Hollywood, lounging on a beach in Brazil under a false name, was not facing any of that, not yet. The trials of the other defendants proceeded through the California court system in the years following Nick's murder, and each one added another layer to the public understanding of what had happened in August 2000. Ryan Hoyt went to trial first. The case against him was straightforward in its essential facts. He had driven to the hills, he had the weapon, he had shot Nick 9 times. His defense attempted to argue diminished capacity, tried to paint a picture of a young man so dominated by Jesse Hollywood, so conditioned to do whatever Jesse asked, that his individual moral agency had been essentially suppressed. That Jesse Hollywood had given him the gun, had given him the order, had used the debt Ryan owed him as leverage to make Ryan do the worst possible thing. The jury did not find this sufficient mitigation. Ryan Hoyt was convicted of first-degree murder with special circumstances. He was sentenced to death. He sits on California's death row today. A young man who drove into the hills with a gun because the person he owed money to told him to, and who has spent every year since paying a price that will ultimately cost him his life. Jesse Rudge's trial was more complex, more contested, and produced outcomes that many people found deeply unsatisfying. Rudge had been the most present figure in Nick's captivity, the one who spent the most time with the boy across those 3 days, who had been at the gatherings where Nick was brought, who had in many ways served as Nick's primary captor, even if he had not been the one to pull the trigger. His defense argued they had not intended for Nick to be killed, had not known that was what Jesse Hollywood planned, had genuinely believed that Nick would eventually be released. Whether any of that was true was something that only Jesse Rudge himself could know with certainty. What was established was that he had been present, that he had participated, that he had not taken any of the many opportunities available to him to help Nick get away, or to alert someone who could have intervened. Rudge was convicted of kidnapping and of being an accessory to murder. He received a sentence of 15 years to life. Many people, including members of the Markowitz family, felt this was insufficient, that the time Rudge spent with Nick, the intimacy of that captivity, the opportunities he had and didn't take, all of it suggested a level of culpability that the sentence did not fully address. But the California justice system had rendered its verdict, and Rudge's sentence stood. William Skidmore and Graham Presley also faced trial, also were convicted on charges related to the kidnapping, also received sentences that reflected their varying degrees of involvement in what had happened to Nick. Presley, who had been the youngest of the main figures and who had been present but had not played a central organizing role, cooperated with prosecutors and received a lighter sentence. He was released after serving time and has, by most accounts, tried to build a life in the years since, a life shadowed permanently by the choices he made when he was barely more than a teenager himself. Each of these trials, each of these verdicts and sentences, added to the record of what had happened to Nick Markowitz in August 2000. Added to the accumulating portrait of a crime that had involved not just the person who ordered it and the person who carried it out, but an entire social ecosystem of young people who had been present, who had known, who had had choices and made the wrong ones. And through all of it, Jesse Hollywood was in Brazil, living as Eduardo Lopes, breathing the salt air off the Atlantic, waiting, perhaps, for the attention to fade, for the investigations to conclude and the interest to wane and the world to move on to other things. He did not yet understand that the world was not going to move on. In 2004, something happened that would ultimately contribute to Jesse Hollywood's capture, and that also raised some of the most uncomfortable questions that this entire case generated. A film called Alpha Dog went into production, directed by Nick Cassavetes and eventually released in 2006. Alpha Dog were the events surrounding Nick Markowitz's kidnapping and murder. The names were changed. Jesse Hollywood became Johnny Trulove, the name that had been his alias in real life, now the title character of a Hollywood film. Nick Markowitz became Zach Mazurski. The other real people were given fictional counterparts. Justin Timberlake was cast in a prominent role. The film was the full weight and resources of a major production. It was, by Hollywood standards, a prestige project, a serious crime drama based on a true story, the kind of film that gets attention and awards consideration and wide release. But Jesse James Hollywood had not been tried, had not been convicted, was a fugitive whose case remained open, whose guilt had not yet been adjudicated by any court. And the film, by dramatizing the events and presenting a version of those events to mass audiences before any trial had taken place, raised serious questions about what it meant for the justice process, for the possibility of a fair trial, for the rights of a defendant who had not yet had his day in court, regardless of what anyone personally believed about his guilt. Susan Markowitz had complicated feelings about the film. On one hand, it kept Nick's story in public consciousness. On the other hand, it transformed her son's murder into entertainment before anyone had been held fully accountable for it. The film depicted the character based on Nick, and Susan found aspects of that depiction deeply painful. Her son's death had become a movie that people went to see on a Friday night, and then went home from and had their lives. The legal battles over the film added another layer of complexity to a case that already had more layers than most. There were arguments about whether the film interfered with Jesse Hollywood's right to a fair trial. There were questions about whether certain information about Hollywood's whereabouts had been revealed through the production process. What is clear is that the film, whatever its artistic merits or ethical failures, kept Jesse Hollywood's name and face in front of the public at exact ability was most dangerous for him. By 2005, the world had changed enough that being a fugitive was a substantially harder proposition than it had been 5 years earlier. The internet had matured. Search engines were sophisticated. Photographs traveled instantly across borders. The increased attention that the Alpha Dog production had brought to the case, the renewed circulation of Jesse Hollywood's image and story in news coverage about the film, meant that the pool of people who might, in a beach town in Brazil, look at a young American man and connect his face to a wanted poster had grown significantly. In March 2005, Brazilian authorities received information about a man living in Saquarema, Eduardo Lopes. The tip was specific enough to act on. Brazilian federal police moved on the address in Saquarema and took the man known as Eduardo Lopes into custody. He was 24 years old. He had been living in Brazil for nearly 5 years. He had built a life there, a relationship there, an identity there, all of it constructed on the foundation of a name that was not his. When Brazilian authorities confirmed his identity, the name beneath Eduardo Lopes was exactly what they had suspected: Jesse James Hollywood, wanted in California for first-degree murder, wanted for kidnapping, wanted for 5 years of running from a crime that had taken the life of a 15-year-old boy on a summer morning in the San Fernando Valley. He was in custody. He was identified. And the extradition process, slow, legal, grinding through machinery of international law, had begun. Jesse Hollywood was coming back to California. The extradition was not simple or fast. Brazil's legal system had its own processes to follow, its own determinations to make about whether the charges met the standards required for extradition, its own timeline that operated independently of how urgently California wanted Jesse Hollywood back. Jesse's legal team, both in Brazil and in the United States, worked to slow the process. Arguments were made. Motions were filed. Every available mechanism for delay was deployed. This is not unusual in extradition cases. It is, in fact, exactly what defense attorneys are supposed to do on behalf of their clients. But for Susan Markowitz, for Jeff Markowitz, for everyone who'd been waiting for this moment for 5 years, every month of legal maneuvering was another month of delayed justice. The Markowitz family had already waded through years of other trials, had already sat in courtrooms and heard testimony about Nick's last days that no parent should ever have to hear, had already watched Ryan Hoyt be sentenced to death and Jesse Rugg receive 15 years to life, and the other defendants receive their various outcomes, all of it real, all of it meaningful. and none of it the same as having the person who had ordered their son's death stand before a jury and answer for it. Jesse Hollywood, even in custody in Brazil, was not yet in a California courtroom, but he was getting closer. While the extradition proceedings wound through their necessary legal processes, the investigation back in California continued to build. Prosecutors were preparing a case that would need to withstand the scrutiny of a jury, would need to address the specific legal questions about Jesse Hollywood's role, about what exactly he had ordered, what he had known, what his intent had been. The central question was not whether Jesse Hollywood had taken Nick Markowitz. That was established. Not whether he had held Nick against his will. That was established. The central question, the question that would determine whether Jesse Hollywood faced first-degree murder charges with special circumstances, the charges that carried the possibility of death, was whether he had ordered Nick's murder with premeditation and deliberation. Brian Hoyt had said he had said, in his own statements and through the implications of everything he testified to, that Jesse had given him the weapon and the instruction, and that the instruction had been unambiguous. Other witnesses would say similar things, would describe conversations and statements that painted a picture of Jesse Hollywood deciding, in those critical days of August 2000, that Nick Markowitz could not simply be released, that Nick had seen too much, knew too much, could identify too many people, that the kidnapping, which had already been a serious crime, had created a problem that Jesse Hollywood had determined could only be resolved one way. Whether the jury would find that evidence sufficient for a first-degree murder conviction. That was the question that would define Jesse Hollywood's fate. But first he had to get to California. And in 2006 he finally did. Jesse James Hollywood arrived back in California in 2006, more than 6 years after Nick Markowitz's murder. He was 25 years old. He had spent nearly a quarter of his life as a fugitive, living under a false name in a beach town on the other side of the world, building a fiction over the reality of what he had done. He was taken into custody by California authorities and held while the legal proceedings that would lead to his trial began their long, complex unfolding. There were preliminary hearings, motions, arguments about evidence, arguments about the impact of the Alpha Dog film on the possibility of a fair trial. Jesse's defense team was experienced and thorough and committed to every available avenue for protecting their clients' rights and interests. The trial itself would not begin immediately, would not begin for years. In fact, the machinery of the California criminal justice system in a high-profile murder case moves at its own pace, and the pace is not fast. But Jesse Hollywood was no longer in Brazil, was no longer Eduardo Lopes, was no longer free. He was in California, facing the full weight of what he had set in motion on a Sunday morning in August 2000, and in a courtroom not far from the neighborhood where he had grown up, where he had built his operation and his persona and his reputation as Johnny Trulove. The truth about what had happened to Nicholas Markowitz was about to be told in the only place where it truly mattered, under oath, before a jury, in a room where the evidence could finally be laid out in full, and the man most responsible for a 15-year-old boy's death to sit and listen to all of it. The trial of Jesse James Hollywood was coming, and it would be worth the wait. The Santa Barbara County Courthouse sits in the heart of downtown Santa Barbara, a Spanish colonial revival building of white stucco and red tile that looks more like a cathedral than a place where people are tried for murder. It is beautiful in the way that much of Santa Barbara is beautiful, deliberately, almost aggressively so, as though the city has decided that aesthetic perfection is a civic obligation. Bougainvillea climbs the walls. Palm trees line the streets outside. The sky above it is almost always a deep, clear California blue. It is a strange place to try a murder case. Strange in the way that all of California's beauty is strange when it sits alongside its darkness. The sun too bright, the flowers too vivid. The contrast between the physical world and the human horror being processed inside it too sharp to fully absorb. Jesse James Hollywood's trial began in 2009, 9 years after the murder of Nicholas Markowitz. 9 years after a 15-year-old boy had been taken from a street in West Hills on a Sunday morning and driven north and shot 9 times in the hills above this very city. Jesse was 28 years old by the time he sat in that courtroom. He had spent nearly a third of his life either running from this moment or waiting for it. And now it had arrived. The prosecution was led by Joshua Lynn, a Santa Barbara County Deputy District Attorney who had been involved in the case for years and who had built a thorough, methodical presentation of the evidence. Lynn understood that the central challenge of prosecuting Jesse Hollywood was not establishing that he had been involved in Nick's kidnapping. That was not seriously disputed. The challenge was proving that Jesse Hollywood had ordered Nick's murder, that he had made a deliberate, premeditated decision to have a 15-year-old boy killed, and had then used Ryan Hoyt as the instrument of that decision. To do that, Lynn would need witnesses. Would need the people who had been present in those critical days to tell the jury what they had seen and heard. Would need the evidence, the physical evidence, the phone records, the statements, to form a coherent and convincing picture of a young man who had chosen murder as a solution to a problem he had created himself. The defense, led by attorney James Blatt, had a different task. Not to deny Jesse's presence in the story, that was impossible, but to challenge the prosecution's characterization of his intent. To argue that while Jesse had made serious and criminal choices, those choices had not included ordering Nick Markowitz's death. That Ryan Hoyt had acted on his own initiative, or had misunderstood or had escalated a situation past what Jesse had intended. That the murder of Nicholas Markowitz, terrible as it was, had not been what Jesse Hollywood ordered. These were the two narratives that would compete in the courtroom for the weeks of the trial, and the jury would have to decide which one was true. The prosecution began by laying the foundation carefully. Before the jury could understand the crime, they had to understand the world in which it had occurred. Joshua Lynn walked them through the landscape of Jesse Hollywood's operation, the marijuana distribution, the social hierarchy, the persona of Johnny Truelove, and what that persona meant in practical terms. He established the debt that Ben Markowitz owed Jesse. He established the vandalism of the Hollywood family home. He established the escalating frustration that had led Jesse to make the decision to take Nick off the street. This groundwork mattered because it answered the question that juries always need answered in cases like this: why? Why would a 20-year-old with money and a comfortable life make a decision as catastrophic as kidnapping? The answer was not simple or satisfying, it never is, but it was coherent. Jesse Hollywood had built his identity around being someone who could not be crossed without consequences. When Ben Markowitz crossed him and nothing happened, that identity was threatened. And Jesse Hollywood had decided that threatening his identity was something he could not allow. Nick Markowitz was the collateral of that decision. The witnesses came one by one, and each one added something to the picture. People who had been at the gatherings where Nick was present testified about what they had seen, about Nick being there, about the atmosphere of those days, the strange, surreal quality of a kidnapping victim being brought to parties, being present in social situations, being visibly not free while the people around him pretended otherwise. Some of these witnesses had their own legal complications. Some had already been convicted of charges related to the case. Some had made deals with prosecutors in exchange for their testimony. The defense would use this against them, would hammer on the incentives they had to shape their testimony in ways that protected their own interests. This is standard practice in cases where witnesses have criminal exposure, and it is effective because it plants genuine seeds of doubt. But the core of what they described was consistent. Nick had been taken, Nick had been held. Nick had been present at multiple locations over 3 days, and the people around him had known he was not there by choice. The testimony that mattered most, that the prosecution had built toward, that the defense feared most, came from the witnesses who could speak to what Jesse Hollywood had said and decided in those critical hours before Ryan Hoyt drove into the hills. One of the most significant witnesses was Casey Sheehan, a young man who had been present in Jesse Hollywood's circle during those days and who had heard things, had been in conversations, had been close enough to the center of what was happening to have knowledge that no one else could provide in quite the same way. Sheehan testified that Jesse Hollywood had discussed what to do about Nick. that the conversations had been direct and unambiguous, that Jesse had expressed concern, not sympathy, but strategic concern, about what it meant to release Nick after everything he had seen and heard. Nick could identify people. Nick could go to police. Nick's release created a risk that Jesse Hollywood had decided he was not willing to accept. The prosecution argued that this was the decision point, the moment when what had been a serious crime became a capital one. When Jesse Hollywood had looked at the situation he had created and chosen, deliberately and with premeditation, to eliminate the problem by eliminating Nick. The defense challenged Sheehan's account, challenged his credibility, his motivations, the reliability of his memory. But the testimony was in the record. The jury had heard it. Ryan Hoyt did not testify at Jesse Hollywood's trial in the way that might have been most useful to the prosecution. His own legal situation, sentenced to death, with ongoing appeals, created complications around his testimony that limited what the jury heard directly from him. But the evidence of what Ryan Hoyt had done was thoroughly presented. The physical evidence from the burial site, the forensic analysis, the TC9, the 9 bullets that had ended Nick Markowitz's life, and the question of where that weapon had come from. Who had provided it, what the provision of that weapon implied about intent and planning, was central to the prosecution's case. Jesse Hollywood had given Ryan Hoyt the gun. This was the prosecution's argument, supported by witness testimony. And if Jesse Hollywood had given Ryan Hoyt the gun, knowing what Ryan Hoyt was going to do with it, if the weapon was provided as part of an instruction, as part of a plan, then the premeditation required for first-degree murder was present. The defense disputed this, argued that the weapon's origin was not as cleanly established as the prosecution suggested, argued that even if Jesse had provided the weapon, that did not prove he had specifically intended for it to be used to kill Nick, that there were innocent explanations, or at least less culpable explanations, for the chain of events. The jury listened to all of it. Listened to days of testimony, weeks of evidence, the competing narratives laid out by 2 skilled legal teams on behalf of their opposing interests. And then they deliberated. Susan Markowitz sat through the trial in the way that only a parent can sit through the trial of the person responsible for their child's death, with a terrible, focused attention that is both necessary and devastating. Every piece of testimony was another piece of the picture of what Nick's last days had been. Every witness who described seeing Nick at a gathering, every account of those 3 days between his abduction and his murder, was a portrait of her son's final hours that she had not had before, and that she could not have once she did. She heard testimony about Nick at the parties, about Nick talking to people, laughing, trying to navigate the impossible situation he had been put in. She heard about the gatherings and the marijuana and the casual, almost bored way that some of the people around Nick had treated his captivity as simply another feature of those summer days. She heard about the grave being dug in the hills above Santa Barbara. She heard about 9 shots, and she sat through all of it because Nick deserved that. Because bearing witness was something she could do for her son, even when there was nothing else left to do. Because she had promised herself, in those first terrible days after Nick's body was found, that she would not let the world forget what had happened to him. That she would be present for every step of the justice process, however long it took and however painful it was. She was present. Jesse Hollywood, for his part, maintained throughout the proceedings the kind of controlled, carefully managed demeanor that defendants in high-profile trials typically present when they have experienced legal counsel advising them. He dressed appropriately. He responded to his attorneys. He did not visibly react to testimony in ways that could be used against him. But there were moments reported by journalists covering the trial, observed by people in the courtroom, when the composure seemed to cost something. When the weight of what was being described, the specificity of the evidence, the faces of the Markowitz family across the courtroom, registered in ways that the managed exterior could not entirely conceal. He was not the same person who had fled California in 2000. 9 years had passed. He was 28, not 20. Whatever he had thought in those days of running, about who he was and what his life would be, Whatever Eduardo Lopes and Saquarema had told himself about the future, he was here now, in this courtroom, with this evidence, with these people looking at him, with Nick Markowitz's family looking at him. The defense made its most sustained effort around the question of intent. James Blatt argued that the prosecution had not proven, beyond a reasonable doubt, that Jesse Hollywood had specifically ordered Ryan Hoyt to kill Nick Markowitz, that the witnesses who testified to such instructions had their own agendas, their own deals, their own reasons to say what the prosecution needed them to say, that Ryan Hoyt had been an unstable, debt-ridden young man who had made his own catastrophic decision, a decision that Jesse Hollywood had not anticipated and had not ordered. This argument had a logic to it, even if it was a difficult one to sustain in the face of the full weight of the prosecution's case. It is always possible, in cases where the actual trigger was pulled by someone other than the defendant being tried, to argue that the chain of causation is not as direct as prosecutors claim, that there are intervening decisions, intervening actors, moments where the outcome was not predetermined. But the prosecution had an answer to this, had witness testimony about Jesse Hollywood's state of mind, had the evidence of the weapon, had the timeline that showed a 20-year-old man, over the course of 3 days, moving from a kidnapping to a calculation about what the kidnapping required, to a solution that involved a gun and a grave in the hills above Santa Barbara. That timeline told a story, and the jury had been listening to it very carefully. The jury deliberated for several days in which Susan and Jeff Markowitz waited, in which the years of waiting, the years since August 2000, since the discovery of Nick's body, since the arrests and the trials and the fugitive hunt and the extradition, compressed into this final, excruciating pause before the verdict arrived. Several days in which Jesse Hollywood sat in the legal machinery's grip and waited for 12 people who had never known him to decide what the rest of his life would look like. Several days in which the city of Santa Barbara went about its ordinary business outside the courthouse walls. The bougainvillea still climbing, the palm trees still lining the streets, the sky still its deep and indifferent California blue, and then the jury came back. The verdict was delivered on August 26, 2009. Jesse James Hollywood was found guilty of first-degree murder. The jury also found true the special circumstance allegation of murder in the commission of a kidnapping, the finding that would make Jesse Hollywood eligible for the death penalty. The verdict was read in a courtroom that had been waiting for this moment for 9 years. 9 years since Nick Markowitz had been taken from a street a few miles from home. 9 years since his body had been found in the hills above the city where his killer was now sitting, convicted, facing the possibility of death. Susan Markowitz, by multiple accounts, wept. Not the tears of someone surprised. She had believed in this verdict, had worked toward it, had dedicated nearly a decade of her life to the certainty that this day would arrive. But the tears of someone for whom a long and terrible journey had reached the end of one of its stages. Not the end of grief. Grief does not have an end. But the end of the legal uncertainty. The end of the question of whether Jesse James Hollywood would be held accountable. He would be. He had been. The penalty phase followed the guilty verdict, the portion of the trial in which the prosecution argues for death and the defense argues for life in prison without the possibility of parole. This is in many ways the most emotionally raw portion of a capital trial, because it moves the focus from the facts of the crime to the question of what should be done with the person who committed it. The prosecution presented the case for death with the same methodical thoroughness it had applied to the guilt phase. The crime was heinous. The victim was 15 years old and entirely innocent. The defendant had orchestrated the kidnapping, had made the decision to have Nick killed, had provided the weapon, and had then fled for 5 years rather than facing any of the consequences. Each of these factors, individually and together, the prosecution argued, supported the ultimate penalty. The defense presented mitigation. Presented Jesse Hollywood's background, his upbringing. His age at the time of the crime, he had been 20, barely an adult, shaped by a world that had never once demanded he develop genuine moral accountability. Presented the argument that life in prison without parole was itself a severe and adequate punishment. that death was not required by justice, and that the state's interest in finality could be served without an execution. It was the kind of argument that defense attorneys in capital cases always make. Because they must, because their obligation to their client demands it. And it was the kind of argument that, in the specific context of Nick Markowitz's case, had to contend with the full weight of what a 15-year-old boy's life had been worth, and how casually it had been taken. The penalty phase jury deliberated on the question of Jesse Hollywood's sentence, and they returned a verdict that surprised many observers, divided public opinion, and gave Susan Markowitz and her family a complicated set of feelings that she has spoken about publicly in the years since. The jury did not sentence Jesse Hollywood to death. They sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Jesse James Hollywood would spend the rest of his natural life in a California state prison. He would not be executed. He would grow old behind bars. He would live, and in living, would carry what he had done every day for the rest of his life. Whether that outcome was just, whether it was sufficient, whether it honored what had been taken from Nick Markowitz and from his family, is a question that does not have a clean answer. Susan Markowitz has expressed, in various ways at various times, that she found the outcome complicated, that life without parole was a serious punishment, but that there was something in the jury's decision not to impose death that felt to her like an incomplete accounting. Others felt differently, felt that life in prison without parole was itself a profound consequence, that Jesse Hollywood would die in prison, would never again see the ocean or drive a car or make a free choice about how to spend a morning, and that this was in its own way a justice that fit the crime. Both of those positions are comprehensible. Both of them are human responses to an outcome that the law had arrived at, and that the people most affected by the crime had to live with whether it fully satisfied them or not. Jesse James Hollywood was formally sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He was transported to a California state correctional facility, where he remains today. The young man who had called himself Johnny Truelove, who had run marijuana through the west side of Los Angeles and built a persona around being untouchable, who had taken a 15-year-old boy off a street because his brother owed $1,200, and who had then ordered that boy's death rather than face the consequences of his own choices. He is, today, a middle-aged man in a prison cell. The ocean he could see from the beach in Saquarema is a memory he carries in a place he can never return to. But the story of Jesse James Hollywood does not end with the verdict, does not end with the sentencing. Because stories like this one, stories that involve real people and real loss in the long aftermath of violence, do not resolve cleanly into silence once the legal system has finished with them. There are threads still running, still pulling at the fabric of what happened in August 2000 and what it meant and what it cost. Ryan Hoyt remains on California's death row, his appeals ongoing, the ultimate resolution of his case still years away. Jesse Rugg has served his time and been released, paroled, living somewhere in the world, carrying what he did with him into a freedom that Nick Markowitz never had the chance to reach. The others involved have moved through the legal system and out the other side, their lives reshaped by what they participated in, and Nick Markowitz remains 15 years old, remains the boy who was walking down a street on a Sunday morning in the summer of 2000, remains the center of a story that is, despite everything, despite the verdicts and the sentences and the years, fundamentally about the loss of someone who should have had so much more time. There is a particular kind of silence that settles over a case after the verdicts have been read, and the sentences have been handed down and the courtroom has emptied and the journalists have filed their final stories and moved on to the next thing. A silence that is not peace, not for the families, not for anyone whose life was permanently altered by what happened, but a kind of enforced stillness that the legal system produces when it has finished doing what it does and declared the matter resolved. For the Markowitz family, that silence arrived in the fall of 2009. Jesse Hollywood had been convicted, had been sentenced to life without parole. The man most responsible for Nick's death was in a prison cell, and the case that had consumed nearly a decade of their lives had reached its formal conclusion. And yet, The silence that followed was not simple. Was not the relief that people who have not experienced this kind of loss sometimes imagine arrives when justice is delivered. Susan Markowitz has spoken about this in interviews given in the years since the trial, has described the way that the verdict, as necessary and important as it was, did not touch the grief, did not reach the part of her that had lost her son, did not fill the space that Nick's absence had carved into her life in August 2000 and had never stopped carving since. Justice, she has said in various ways at various times, is not the same as healing. It is not the same as having your child back. It is not even necessarily the same as peace. It is its own thing, important, necessary, worth fighting for with every resource and every year of your life. But separate from grief, parallel to grief, never quite overlapping with the one at the center of everything. This is one of the truths that true crime in its most honest form has to reckon with. The story does not end when the verdict is read. The story continues in the lives of the people who were left behind. Continues in the grief of parents who outlived their children because of violence. Continues in the long, quiet, daily work of carrying an absence that never becomes lighter. Only with time and effort and the support of people who love you more manageable. Susan Markowitz has done that work, has carried that absence, and has done something with it that deserves to be acknowledged clearly and without sentimentality. She has refused to let Nick be forgotten. In the years following Jesse Hollywood's conviction, Susan Markowitz became increasingly active in victim advocacy work. This is a path that many parents of murder find themselves on, not because it is the only response to loss, but because for some people transforming grief into action is the only way to keep moving forward. To take the thing that destroyed something precious and use it to build something meaningful. Susan established the Nick Markowitz Fund, dedicated to keeping her son's memory alive and to supporting causes he cared about. She gave interviews. She spoke publicly about the impact of Nick's murder, not just on her family, but on the broader question of how communities respond to violence. How the systems around young people, the social systems, the legal systems, the cultural systems, either protect them or fail them. She spoke about the people who had known Nick was being held and had said nothing. About the silence of bystanders. About what it means when a community of young people decides that looking the other way is safer than doing the right thing. About the cost of that silence. A cost paid not by the people who maintained it but by a 15-year-old boy who never got to grow up. These conversations were not comfortable. Were not the kind of thing that people who had been on the periphery of what happened to Nick could hear, without feeling the weight of their own choices from those August days pressing back against them. But Susan had decided that discomfort was a price worth paying if it meant that the question she was asking, what do you do when you know something is wrong and you have the power to act, reached even a few people who needed to hear it. The Alpha Dog film, released in 2006, had brought the case to a wider audience than it might otherwise have reached, and its impact continued to be felt in the years after Jesse Hollywood's conviction. The film had been a commercial and critical moderate success, not a blockbuster, but substantial enough to introduce the story of Nick Markowitz's murder to people who had never heard of Jesse Hollywood or Cheviot Hills or the summer of 2000. For some of those people, the film was simply a crime drama, compelling, well-acted, the kind of movie that prompts a brief conversation on the drive home about how people end up making terrible decisions. For others, particularly people who knew enough about the real case to recognize the divergences between the film and reality, it was a more complicated experience. The film had taken liberties, as films based on true stories inevitably do. Characters had been combined, compressed, reimagined. The emotional arc had been shaped for dramatic effect, and some of those shapings had consequences, had created impressions about the real people involved that were not entirely accurate, had presented versions of events that served the film's narrative needs, rather than the strict requirements of truth. Susan Markowitz's relationship with the film remained complicated long after its release. She has said that she understood why it was made, understood the genuine interest in her son's story, the real questions it raised about youth and violence and privilege and consequence. But she has also been clear about what it cost her personally to see Nick's death dramatized and distributed and discussed as entertainment, while she was still in the process of burying him. Figuratively speaking, every single day, there is something that happens to the families of murder victims when their loved one's death becomes a cultural product, a film, a podcast, a true crime series, a book. Something that is worth sitting with rather than explaining away. The victim, who in life was a specific and irreplaceable person, becomes in death a story, a narrative. Something that can be packaged and consumed and argued about, and then set aside when the audience is done with it. And the family, that victim, has to watch that transformation happen, and keep happening, over and over, while they themselves can never set the story aside because the story is their life. Nick Markowitz has been discussed in articles and podcasts and forums and documentaries. Has been the subject of debate about the ethics of true crime storytelling, about the Alpha Dog film's right to exist, about the specific decisions made by the young men who were present during his captivity and did nothing to help him. He has been, in a real sense, one of the cases that helped shape the modern true crime genre, or his understanding of its own responsibilities and limitations. And through all of that, he has also simply been Susan Markowitz's son, 15 years old, gone since August 2000, loved every single day since then with a ferocity that has never diminished. Jesse Hollywood, meanwhile, settled into the long reality of life in a California state prison. He is, at the time this story is being told, in his early 40s. He has spent more of his adult life inside prison walls than outside them. The world he grew up in, the Cheviot Hills neighborhood, the west side of Los Angeles. The particular culture of the late 1990s that produced him and the people around him has changed substantially in the decades since he was last free to move through it. The music is different. The technology is unrecognizable compared to the flip phones and early internet of 2000. The city itself has transformed. He is serving life without parole. He will not be released, barring extraordinary legal developments, the kind of post-conviction reversals that are theoretically possible but practically rare in cases with the weight of evidence that is had. Jesse James Hollywood will die inside a California correctional facility. Will grow old there. Will spend every remaining year of his life in the institution. Whether he thinks about Nick Markowitz is something only he can know. Whether he thinks about the summer of 2000 and the decision he made, and the morning he sent Ryan Hoyt into the hills with a gun. Whether those thoughts visit him in the particular quiet of a prison night, when there is nothing to do and nowhere to go and the hours have to be occupied with whatever the mind produces, when it has only itself for company. That is not something anyone outside those walls can speak to. What can be said is that the consequences arrived. Delayed by years of running, complicated by the legal and ethical tangles that surrounded the case, made harder by the intervening film, and the extradition and the long machinery of justice, but arrived nonetheless. Johnny Truelove is in prison. Jesse James Hollywood will never be free again. The other principal figures in this story have had their own afterlives, their own post-conviction trajectories that are worth tracing, because they tell us something about how the legal system distributes consequence, and how people carry the weight of what they've done. Ryan Hoyt remains on California's death row. He has been there since his conviction in 2001, more than 2 decades of appeals of legal proceedings, of the slow and expensive machinery of capital punishment working through its processes. California's death row is, in practice, not the swift execution that the phrase implies. The state has not carried out an execution in many years, and the legal and political landscape around capital punishment in California has shifted substantially in the time since Ryan Hoyt was sentenced. What this means, practically, is that Ryan Hoyt is alive, is middle-aged, is living in the specific and terrible circumstances of death row, the isolation, the restrictions, the knowledge that the state has determined his life should end, and the uncertainty about when, or whether that determination will be carried out. He was 20 years old when he drove into the hills above Santa Barbara with a Tefy 9. He was motivated, the evidence suggests, by the debt he owed Jesse Hollywood, by the desire to clear that debt, to earn his place in Jesse's world, to be useful in the way that the lowest ranking member of a hierarchy is useful. when the person above him needs something done that no one else will do. This is not an excuse, is not even really a mitigation, given that Ryan Hoyt was an adult who made his own choices. But it is a context, and it is worth noting because it speaks to something important about how violence moves through social structures, how it flows downward, from the person with power to the person without it, with the person without power absorbing the worst of the consequences. Jesse Hollywood, who had the most power and made the essential decision, received life without parole. Ryan Hoyt, who had the least power and carried out the decision he had been given, received the death sentence. The disparity in those outcomes is something that legal scholars and ethicists, and people who think carefully about justice have noted and argued about in the years since both sentences were handed down. It does not mean Jesse Hollywood's sentence was inadequate. Life without parole is a severe and serious punishment. But it does raise the question, a question that has no comfortable answer, of whether the distribution of consequence in this case fully reflected the distribution of culpability. Jesse Rudge was paroled after serving his sentence. He has lived, by most accounts, a quiet life in the years since his release, out of the public eye, out of the headlines, carrying whatever he carries from those days in August 2000 into a daily existence that he has not chosen to discuss publicly with any regularity. His release has been, for the Markowitz family, one of the harder realities of the aftermath. Rudge had been the most present figure in Nick's captivity, had spent the most time with the boy, had had more opportunities than almost anyone else to intervene, to help, to do something that might have changed the outcome. And he had not taken any of them. He is free. Nick is not. This is not a statement about whether Rudge's sentence was legally appropriate. Courts and juries and the California penal system made those determinations, and they made them through the proper processes. It is simply a statement of fact that sits uncomfortably in the air around this case, the way many facts in cases like this one sit uncomfortably, refusing to resolve into anything that feels adequate. Graham Presley, who cooperated with prosecutors and received a lighter sentence in exchange, has also been released. He was the youngest of the main figures, barely into his teens when the events of August 2000 occurred, present at the edges of what happened rather than at its center. His cooperation with the prosecution was, in the legal calculus of the case, valuable. His testimony helped build the record that contributed to convictions. Whether that value was adequately compensated by the reduction in his sentence is another of the questions that circles this case without a clean answer. The question of what this case tells us, the broader lessons that can be extracted from the story of Jesse Hollywood and Nick Markowitz and the summer of 2000, is one that has been explored in many forums over many years, and it is worth sitting with. Even though the lessons are not simple, and do not compress neatly into the kind of takeaways that make people feel better about the darkness they have just spent time examining. One of the things this case illuminates is the danger of consequence-free environments. Jesse Hollywood had spent his entire young life in a world where the normal mechanisms that produce accountability, where actions have predictable results, where people are held to standards and made to answer for violations of those standards, had not functioned. His father's involvement in the drug trade had modeled a way of operating outside normal rules. The social world he built around himself rewarded the very behaviors that should have been checked. The persona of Johnny Truelove was built on the premise that he was someone who could not be touched. Every time that premise went untested, every time Jesse made a decision that should have had consequences and the consequences didn't come, the premise was reinforced. And the reinforced premise made the next, worst decision easier to arrive at. This is not a unique pattern. It is, in fact, one of the most common patterns in the lives of people who eventually commit serious violence. Not the violence of desperation or survival, but the violence of entitlement. The violence of people who have come to genuinely believe that the rules that govern everyone else's behavior do not apply to them. The specific context of Jesse Hollywood's world, the wealth, the suburban setting, the drug trade operating in a comfortable neighborhood rather than a desperate one makes it feel unusual. But the underlying dynamic is familiar. Privilege, in its most corrosive form, does not protect people from violence. it sometimes produces it. Another thing this case illuminates is the role of bystanders, the people who knew. The people who were present at those gatherings where Nick was held, who saw a 15-year-old boy who was clearly not there by choice, and who said nothing, did nothing, looked away or told themselves it wasn't their business or calculated that the risk of speaking up was greater than the cost of staying silent. Nick Markowitz died in part because of what Jesse Hollywood decided, in part because of what Ryan Hoyt did, and in part because of the silence of people who'd intervened and chose not to. This is a harder lesson to sit with because it implicates not dramatic evil but ordinary human failure, the failure of moral courage, the failure to act when action is difficult and costly. The bystanders in this case were not monsters. They were young people who were scared or self-interested, or simply hadn't developed the moral muscle required to do the hard thing when the hard thing presented itself. And a 15-year-old boy died because of it. Susan Markowitz has spoken about this dimension of the case with particular force, about what it means when a community decides that looking the other way is the safer choice, about the specific, identifiable moments where a different decision by one person could have changed the outcome for her son. She does not say this to assign guilt beyond what the courts have assigned. She says it because she believes, and the evidence of this case supports the belief, that the culture of silence that surrounded what happened to Nick was not accidental, was not individual, was a feature of the world those young people had built together, a world in which the cost of speaking up was made to seem higher than the cost of staying quiet. The cost of staying quiet was Nick Markowitz's life. The true crime genre, which has expanded enormously in the years since Nick Markowitz's murder, has grappled with the ethics of its own existence in ways that this case helped prompt. The Alpha Dog film, released before Jesse Hollywood's trial, became a reference point in discussions about when it is appropriate to dramatize a crime, about what obligations storytellers have to the families of victims, about the difference between honoring a victim's memory and exploiting their death for entertainment. These are not abstract questions. They are questions that have real effects on real people. Susan Markowitz experienced those effects directly, experienced what it meant to have her son's murder turned into a film that audiences could watch and discuss and set aside, while she carried it every day without the option of setting it aside. The true crime genre has, in the years since, developed more sophisticated and contested conversations about these issues, about consent, whether the families of victims should have some input into how their loved ones' stories are told, about accuracy, the obligation to get the facts right and to distinguish clearly between what is documented and what is dramatized, about purpose, whether a piece of true crime content is genuinely trying to illuminate something meaningful about crime and justice and human behavior, or whether it is simply mining tragedy for entertainment value. None of those conversations have produced clean answers. They are ongoing, evolving, shaped by each new case and each new piece of content and each new set of family members who have to navigate the transformation of their grief into someone else's story. But this case is part of where those conversations started, part of what made people think more carefully about what it means to tell stories about real violence and real loss. There is a place in the hills above Santa Barbara where the ground was disturbed on August 9, 2000, where a grave was dug and a boy was placed in it and shot 9 times, where Nicholas Markowitz's body lay for 2 days before hikers found it and called the authorities. The area around Lizard's Mouth is still a place that hikers visit, a popular trail destination, beautiful country, the kind of California landscape that people drive up from the city to experience on weekends. Most of the people who hike those trails today do not know what happened there in the summer of 2000. Do not know that a 15-year-old boy died on this hillside because of a $1,200 debt that had nothing to do with him. But some people do know. Some people who make that drive and walk those trails carry the knowledge with them and feel it in the particular quality of the quiet there, the way the hills hold silence in a specific way, the way the light falls through the oak trees in the late afternoon. Nick Markowitz was there. In the most terrible way, in the most terrible circumstances, At the most terrible moment of a life that had barely started, he was there. On those hills, in that landscape that California keeps offering up, as beautiful regardless of what human beings have done within it. There is one more thread to pull on before this part of the story moves toward its conclusion. A thread that runs not through the courtrooms or the prison cells or the hills above Santa Barbara, but through the specific and ongoing reality of what it means to lose a child to violence and continue living. Susan Markowitz has continued to live, has continued to advocate, has continued to speak about Nick and about the case and about the broader questions it raises. She has done this, by her own account, not because it is easy but because it is necessary. Because the alternative silence, withdrawal, the private management of a grief that has no adequate public expression, would mean in some sense that the people who took Nick had taken everything. She has not let them take everything. This is worth saying clearly. In a story that has so much darkness, so much failure, so much evidence of what people are capable of when they choose cruelty over conscience, the persistence of a mother who refused to let her son be forgotten is something that cuts against all of that. Not as a redemption of the tragedy. Nothing redeems the tragedy. But as a demonstration of what love looks like when it has no other option but to keep going. Nick Markowitz would be in his late 30s today if he had lived. Would have had nearly a quarter century of life beyond the summer of 2000. Would have grown, changed, become someone that even the people who loved him could not have fully predicted. Would have had his own story, separate from this one. A story about whatever he chose to do with the decades that were taken from him. That story never happened. That person never got to exist. And that, more than any verdict or sentence or legal outcome, is the true cost of what Jesse James Hollywood set in motion on a Sunday morning in August 2000. Not the years he will spend in prison. Not the legal proceedings, the extradition, the film, the headlines. Not even the careers of the prosecutors and defense attorneys and journalists and documentarians who have built parts of their professional lives on the story of what happened. The true cost is a boy who was walking down a street and never came home. The true cost is 38 years of a life that did not happen. The true cost is a mother who has spent more than 2 decades carrying an absence that should never have existed. That is what $1,200 bought. That is what Johnny Truelove's pride cost. That is the number that sits at the center of this story and refuses, no matter how many years pass, to become anything other than what it is, a child's life. Taken for nothing. There is a specific kind of reckoning that arrives in the years after a high-profile murder case has wound through the courts and produced its verdicts and settled into the long stillness of post-conviction reality. It is not a dramatic reckoning. It does not arrive with the force of a courtroom revelation or the clarity of a jury's unanimous decision. It arrives quietly, incrementally. In the accumulation of years and the slow work of people trying to understand what happened and why and what it means for the world that continues to exist after the crime. The case of Jesse James Hollywood, of Johnny Truelove, of the murder of Nicholas Markowitz in the hills above Santa Barbara in August 2000, has been subject to exactly this kind of reckoning in the years since Jesse's conviction. Has been examined and re-examined, discussed and debated, held up as an example and dissected as a cautionary tale, in ways that the original participants could not have anticipated when they were living through events that created the story. And in that ongoing examination, certain questions keep returning, keep insisting on being asked even when the answers are uncomfortable or incomplete. Keep demonstrating that the case of Jesse James Hollywood is not simply a story about a drug dealer who made catastrophic decisions in the summer of 2000. It is a story about systems, about culture, about the specific conditions that allow ordinary young people to arrive at extraordinary violence, about what those conditions mean for the communities that produce them and the people who have to live in the aftermath. We have talked about the verdicts. We have talked about the sentences. We have talked about Susan Markowitz and the long work of carrying her son's absence. But there are dimensions of this story that we have not yet fully explored, dimensions that sit in the spaces between the courtroom facts and the human reality of what happened. Dimensions that, If we are going to tell this story honestly, we cannot afford to skip past. So let us go back. Let us return to some of the specific threads that the trial and the years since have continued to pull on. Let us look more closely at the people involved, at the world they came from, at the specific texture of what it meant to be Jesse Hollywood in the summer of 2000, and what it meant to be Nick Markowitz. Jesse James Hollywood did not become Johnny Truelove in a vacuum, did not arrive at the decisions of August 2000 without a history that shaped and enabled those decisions. And while personal responsibility for violence is real, is in fact one of the things that the legal system exists to establish and enforce, it is also true that people are formed by the environments they grow up in. That the values absorbed in childhood, the models of behavior presented in adolescence, the social rewards and punishments that shape the choices available to a young person. All of these things are part of the story of how someone becomes capable of what Jesse Hollywood became capable of. Jack Hollywood, Jesse's father, was investigated in connection with Jesse's flight from California. The question of whether Jack had helped his son disappear, had provided money, connections, or both, was taken seriously by investigators in the years when Jesse was a fugitive. Jack was ultimately charged with offenses related to his alleged assistance in Jesse's escape, and the legal proceedings around his own involvement in the aftermath of Nick's murder added another layer to a case that was already extraordinarily complex. What this suggests, what it has always suggested to people who look carefully at the full picture of Jesse Hollywood's life, is that the culture of Jesse grew up in was not one that valued accountability, was not one that had ever presented Jesse with a model of what it looked like to face consequences for your choices. Jack Hollywood's world was the drug trade, operated with the casual confidence of someone who had learned that the rules could be worked around if you had enough resources and enough nerve. Jesse had absorbed that lesson completely, had built his entire identity on it, and when the consequences of August 2000 arrived, his first instinct, flee, run, put as much distance as possible between himself and the results of his choices, was entirely consistent with everything he had ever been taught about how to respond to difficulty. He ran because he had never been taught to stand still and face things. This is not an excuse, is not even a full explanation, but it is a context, and it matters because it points towards something that Susan Markowitz and others have argued throughout the years since Nick's death, that the environment that produced Jesse Hollywood was itself a failure of parenting, of community, of the systems that should have intervened somewhere along the trajectory of a young man building a drug operation and a persona based on being untouchable. Those interventions never came, and Nick Markowitz paid for their absence. Nick Markowitz's world, by contrast, was one of ordinary teenage life, complicated in the way all teenage lives are complicated, shaped by family dynamics and friendships and the particular pressures of being 15 years old in the late 1990s, but not one marked by the specific pathologies that characterized Jesse Hollywood's environment. People who knew Nick have described him consistently across the years: the humor, the warmth, the ease with which he moved through social situations. He was the kind of teenager who made friends without trying too hard, who had a gift for making people feel comfortable around him, who approached the world with a kind of open curiosity that was genuinely appealing. He was also, in the way of 15-year-olds, still very much in the process of figuring out who he was. His older brother Ben's involvement in the drug world had not been entirely invisible to Nick. It is difficult, in families where an older sibling is involved in something like what Ben was involved in, for that involvement to be completely separate from the family's life. Whether Nick knew the specific details of Ben's debt to Jesse Hollywood, whether he had any awareness of the tensions between his brother and the people his brother owed, these are questions that the evidence does not fully resolve. What is clear is that Nick had done nothing to invite what happened to him, had made no choices that placed him in Jesse Hollywood's world, had simply been Ben Markowitz's younger brother, walking down a street on a Sunday morning, and had been in the wrong place at the wrong moment when Jesse Hollywood's grievance with Ben needed a target. The randomness of that, the terrible arbitrariness of it, is something that sits at the heart of what makes this case so haunting. Nick was not chosen because of anything he had done or any choice he had made. He was chosen because he existed, because he was available, because his brother owed money to someone who had decided that taking something from Ben was the appropriate response to being owed. The 3 days of Nick's captivity, August 6 through August 9, 2000, have been reconstructed through witness testimony and evidence in significant detail. And what that reconstruction reveals is a portrait of a 15-year-old boy who, faced with a situation of genuine terror, found ways to cope that demonstrated a kind of resilience and social intelligence that, in any other context, would have been simply admirable. Nick talked to people. At the gatherings where he was present, he engaged with the older teenagers around him, made conversation, laughed when something was funny, participated in the social fabric of situations that he had not chosen to be in. People who interacted with him during those days have described him as seeming on the surface relatively calm, as someone who was managing the situation with a composure that belied how frightened he must have been underneath. This has been interpreted in different ways by different people. Some have seen it as evidence that Nick did not fully understand the danger he was in, that he believed, perhaps, that this was a temporary situation that would resolve itself, that Jesse Hollywood would get what he wanted from Ben and Nick would be released. Others have seen it as a survival strategy. Nick reading the social dynamics around him and understanding that projecting calm and friendliness was safer than projecting fear or anger. What seems most likely, in the reading of people who have studied the case carefully, is that it was some mixture of both. Nick was 15. He was in a situation for which nothing in his life had prepared him. He was doing what people do in overwhelming circumstances, finding the strategies available to him and using them, talking to people, being likable, making himself feel less like a captive and more like a person. He was not stupid, he was not unaware, but he was 15, and the people around him, the people who knew why he was really there, who understood what the situation actually was, had their own calculations to make. The figure of Jesse Rugg looms particularly large in the reconstruction of those 3 days. Not because Rudge was the most culpable, he was not, and the courts reflected that in the distinction between his sentence and Ryan Hoyt's, but because the time he spent with Nick, the closeness of their interaction during the captivity, makes his ultimate failure to act more personal and more troubling than the failures of people who were more peripheral. Rudge had been with Nick across multiple days and multiple locations. He had talked with him, spent time with him, been present with him in a way that moved, or should have moved, beyond the abstraction of hostage, into the concrete reality of a specific human being, a 15-year-old kid who laughed at jokes and talked about music and was, by any ordinary measure, someone you would like if you met him under normal circumstances. And Rugg had not acted, had not found a moment to tell Nick to run, had not called the police, had not reached out to anyone who might have intervened, had continued to participate in the logic of Jesse Hollywood's world, in which Nick was a problem to be managed rather than a person to be protected. This is a question that does not have a fully satisfying answer. The most plausible explanation is the most mundane one: fear. Fear of Jesse Hollywood, who was not a person you crossed without consequences. Fear of what would happen to Rugg if he helped Nick get away. The social architecture of Jesse's world, which rewarded loyalty and punished deviation, had been constructed precisely to make the cost of going the right thing seem higher than the cost of going along. But the cost of going along was Nick Markowitz's life. And Jesse Rugg had to live with that knowledge while serving his sentence, and has had to live with it in the years since his release. There is a question that Susan Markowitz has indicated she has thought about over the years, a question that has no answer, but that presents itself naturally to anyone who looks closely at the timeline of those 3 days. At what moment, if any, could someone have intervened and changed the outcome? At what point was the decision made that Nick would not be released? When did the kidnapping become a prelude to murder? And was there a window, even a small one, in which a different choice by one person could have led Nick home? The evidence suggests there was. suggests that the decision to kill Nick was not instantaneous, was not made the moment he was taken, but was arrived at over the course of those 3 days as Jesse Hollywood calculated the risks of releasing him. Which means there were hours, possibly many hours, during which the outcome was not yet fixed, during which Jesse Rugg or someone else could have acted. They didn't. The question of what Jesse Hollywood knew and when he knew it, the specific sequence of his decision making during those 3 days, was at the heart of the prosecution's case, and has remained at the heart of the ongoing discussion about what this case means. The prosecution's argument, which the jury ultimately accepted, was that Jesse Hollywood had made a deliberate, premeditated decision to have Nick killed. That the decision had been made because Jesse calculated that releasing Nick created an unacceptable risk, that Nick could identify the people involved in the kidnapping, could go to police, could create legal consequences that Jesse was not prepared to face. This argument has a grim logic to it. It presents Jesse Hollywood not as someone who acted on impulse or passion, but as someone who made a cold, calculating assessment of his own interests and arrived at murder as the most rational solution. A solution to a problem he himself had created. The defense's counter-argument that Ryan Hoyt had acted on his own, or had misunderstood Jesse's intentions, or had escalated the situation beyond what Jesse had wanted, was rejected by the jury. But it is worth sitting with the question of whether there was any version of Jesse Hollywood's psychology in August 2000 that did not lead to Nick's death. Because what the prosecution's narrative reveals, beneath the legal language of premeditation and deliberation, is a portrait of a 20-year-old whose moral development had been so stunted by the world he grew up in that he was genuinely capable of looking at a 15-year-old child, a child he had taken, a child who had done nothing, and calculating that the child's death was preferable to the inconvenience of his continued existence. That is not the psychology of a monster in the cinematic sense. It is the psychology of someone who had never been asked, by anyone or anything in his environment, to genuinely reckon with other people's humanity. Someone for whom other people, even a 15-year-old boy, could be reduced to variables in a calculation about his own interests. This is what consequence-free environments produce, taken to their most catastrophic conclusion. Ryan Hoyt's psychology is, if anything, even more disturbing in its ordinary texture, because Ryan Hoyt was not calculating, was not strategic, was not making the kind of cold cost-benefit analysis that the prosecution attributed to Jesse Hollywood. Ryan Hoyt drove into those hills and shot Nick Markowitz 9 times because Jesse Hollywood asked him to. Because Jesse Hollywood had leverage over him, the debt, the position in the hierarchy, the accumulated weight of being at the bottom of a social structure that rewarded service and punished refusal. Because saying no to Jesse Hollywood was, in the world Ryan Hoyt inhabited, not a real option, or rather it was an option. It is always an option. Every person at every moment retains the capacity to refuse to do terrible things. The moral philosophers are right about this, and the law reflects it. Ryan Hoyt was an adult. He made choices, and the choice he made to drive into those hills, to dig that grave, to shoot a 15-year-old boy 9 times was his choice, and he is serving a death sentence for it. But the conditions that made that choice feel to Ryan Hoyt like a less terrible option than the alternative, the conditions that had placed him in a position of such comprehensive subordination to Jesse Hollywood that murder seemed preferable to refusal, those conditions were also created by a specific world, a specific set of relationships, a specific culture of power and debt, and the violence that enforces them. Ryan Hoyt did not come from the same comfortable background as Jesse Hollywood. His relationship to Jesse's world was one of dependence rather than ownership. He was not running deals and building a persona. He was working off a debt, one task at a time, trying to maintain a position in a social structure that offered him something he couldn't find elsewhere. When Jesse Hollywood handed him a gun and told him what to do, Ryan Hoyt was at the intersection of every bad decision he had ever made and every circumstance that had shaped him. And he made one more bad decision, the final irreversible one. He is on death row because of it, and Nick Markowitz is dead. The relationship between Jesse Hollywood and Ryan Hoyt, the power dynamic, the debt The specific way that Jesse used what Ryan owed him to make Ryan do what Jesse needed done is something that recurs in discussions of this case as an example of how violence is often structured. How the person who orders violence and the person who carries it out occupy different positions in a hierarchy, and how those different positions translate into different legal and moral culpabilities that the justice system then has to try to sort out. This sorting out is always imperfect. The law has doctrines. Conspiracy, aiding and abetting, felony murder, that try to capture the moral reality of situations where multiple people are involved in causing a death. But the law is a blunt instrument, and the moral reality of these situations is often finer grained than the categories available to describe it. Jesse Hollywood ordered a murder. Ryan Hoyt carried it out. Jesse Hollywood received life without parole. Ryan Hoyt received a death sentence. The person with more power got the lesser punishment. Legal scholars who have written about this case have noted the irony, have pointed out that in many capital cases, the person who pulls the trigger receives the harshest sentence precisely because the physical act of killing is what the law is most readily able to assign ultimate culpability to. That the person who orders, who plans, who provides the weapon and the instruction, that person's moral responsibility, which in many ways exceeds the triggerman's, is harder for the legal system to translate into the specific finding of special circumstances that makes a defendant eligible for death. Whether this represents a flaw in the system or simply the inevitable imprecision of trying to translate moral reality into legal categories is itself a question without a clean answer. But it is a question that this case makes impossible to avoid. The world that Jesse Hollywood and his associates inhabited in the late 1990s, the specific cultural ecosystem of young, wealthy, suburban drug dealers who borrowed the aesthetics of gangster culture while being insulated from most of its actual dangers, has been written about extensively in the years since Nick Markowitz's murder, has become, in some ways, a case study in what happens when a certain kind of privilege meets a certain kind of cultural aspiration. The hip-hop and gangster aesthetic that dominated youth culture in that era, the music, the clothing, the language, the values it seemed to project, was created largely by young black men navigating genuinely dangerous circumstances. It emerged from specific histories of poverty and discrimination and violence that gave it an authenticity and a force that it with young people across racial and economic lines. But for young men like Jesse Hollywood, white, wealthy, protected by their neighborhood and their money and their family connections from most of the actual circumstances that had produced the culture they were borrowing, the aesthetic was costume, was performance, was the adoption of a vocabulary of power and consequence without any genuine understanding of what that vocabulary had cost the people who created it. This is not a novel observation. It has been made many times about many people in many contexts. But the case of Jesse James Hollywood gives it a specific, devastating clarity. Because Jesse Hollywood played at being someone who operated by a code of consequences and respect and the violent enforcement of debt. And then he actually enforced that code. Actually followed through on the logic of the persona he had constructed. Took a 15-year-old boy and had him killed over $1,200 because his constructed identity as Johnny Truelove demanded it. The performance became real. And a child died. The Alpha Dog film, which we have discussed in earlier portions of this story, continues to circulate years after its release, continues to introduce new viewers to the case, continues to generate discussions about what happened and who was responsible and what the story means. The film has aged in complicated ways. Some of its choices, which seemed bold or provocative at the time, now read as ethically questionable in ways that the true crime conversation has become better equipped to articulate. One of the most discussed aspects of the film is its treatment of Nick, of the character based on Nick, given the name Zach Mazursky, and played with genuine emotional intelligence by an actor who brought real humanity to the role. The film makes choices about how to portray Zach's time in captivity, choices that emphasize the strange quasi-normalcy of those days, the parties, the socializing, the almost friendship that develops between the captive boy and some of his captors, in ways that some viewers have found humanizing and others have found troubling. The concern is not that the film lies about what happened. The broad strokes, the captivity, the gatherings, the eventual murder, are consistent with the documented facts. The concern is about what the film emphasizes and what it elides, about whether the relative warmth and casualness of the captivity sequences, which serve the film's narrative purpose of making the eventual murder more shocking by contrast, does justice to the terror that Nick Markowitz must have experienced, about whether the audience's emotional engagement with the fictionalized version of Nick adequately reflects the reality of what the real Nick endured. Susan Markowitz has spoken about this in terms that are worth taking seriously. Her son was not Zach Mazursky. Her son was Nick, specific and irreplaceable, a person she had known and loved for 15 years, a person whose interiority and experience and fear during those 3 days she can only imagine, because no one who truly knew can tell her. The film gave audiences a version of those 3 days that was shaped by dramatic and commercial considerations. Her life and her grief are shaped by nothing except the irreversible fact of Nick's absence. There is a dimension of this case that has received less attention than the legal proceedings in the film and the cultural analysis, but that is in some ways the most important dimension of all. The question of what happened to the young people who were present at the edges of those 3 days and chose silence, and what their lives became in the years that followed. Some of them cooperated with prosecutors and received reduced sentences or immunity. Some of them served their time and were released. Some of them have never spoken publicly about what they saw and what they chose not to do. They carry the knowledge of what happened to Nick Markowitz, of their presence at gatherings where he was held, of the moments they might have acted and didn't, into their adult lives. This is its own kind of sentence. Not the kind handed down by courts, not measured in years or restrictions, but the internal kind that has no official end date. The knowledge of what you failed to do, carried forward through every subsequent day of a life that Nick Markowitz didn't get to have. Whether any of those people have genuinely reckoned with that knowledge, whether they have allowed it to change them, to demand something of them, to produce the kind of moral accounting that might transform failure into something that actually means something, that is not something that outsider can know. People's internal lives are private. Their reckoning, if it happens, happens in spaces that are not visible to anyone else. But the question is worth asking, is worth holding open. Because one of the things that cases like this one demonstrate is that the consequences of violence extend far beyond the principal actors, extend into the lives of everyone who was present, who knew, who had choices. And what those people do with their share of the math, how they carry it, how they respond to it, whether they allow it to demand something of them matters, not to the legal record, not to the outcome for Jesse Hollywood or Ryan Hoyt or the Markowitz family, but to the ongoing moral life of the world that the crime occurred in. Nick Markowitz has been gone for more than 2 decades now. The boy who was walking down a street in West Hills on August 6, 2000 has been absent from the world for longer than he was present in it. The years that have passed since his murder have accumulated into a period of time that, if he had lived, would have contained a whole adult life, college, perhaps work, relationships, the gradual becoming of whatever kind of person he would have grown into. That life didn't happen. That person didn't get to exist, and the people who love Nick have had to live alongside that absence for more than 20 years, carrying it into every event and milestone and ordinary day that he was not present for. Susan Markowitz has said in various ways at various times that Nick is with her constantly, that she thinks about him every day, that the grief has not diminished with time so much as it has become integrated, woven into the texture of her daily life in a way that is always present even when it is not at the forefront, that she has found ways to honor him, to keep his memory alive, to make his existence mean something beyond the manner of his death. This is one of the most important things that true crime, at its best, can do. Remind us that the people at the center of these stories were not simply victims, were not defined by how they died, were full human beings with full lives and full futures that were taken from them, and with families who carry them forward every day. Nick Markowitz was not just the 15-year-old who was murdered in the hills above Santa Barbara. He was Susan's son. He was Jeff's son. He was someone's friend, someone's classmate, someone who made people laugh and who had opinions about music, and who's in the process of figuring out who he wanted to be. He deserved to find out. The case of Jesse James Hollywood has been cited, in legal and academic discussions, as an example of several different phenomena. The failure of juvenile accountability systems to catch dangerous trajectories before they culminate in violence. The specific risks created by drug economies operating within otherwise comfortable communities. The legal questions raised by trying to prosecute someone who ordered a murder through an intermediary, when the intermediary himself is facing a different legal process. It has been used in law school classrooms, has been discussed in criminology courses, has been referenced in policy debates about how communities respond to early signs of the kind of behavior that Jesse Hollywood was displaying long before the summer of 2000. Whether any of that academic and policy attention has translated into actual changes in the systems and environments that produced Jesse Hollywood, whether the lessons of this case have actually been absorbed in ways that might prevent the next version of it, is a question that is much harder to answer. Systems change slowly, cultures change even more slowly. The specific conditions that allowed a 20-year-old drug dealer to build a persona around being untouchable and to operate without meaningful accountability until he had committed a capital crime. Those conditions did not disappear when Jesse Hollywood was sentenced to life in prison. They still exist. In different neighborhoods, different communities, different iterations of the same basic dynamic, privilege and entitlement, and the absence of genuine consequence, building towards something that everyone around it can see coming, and that almost no one knows how to stop. Jesse James Hollywood is in his early 40s now. He has been incarcerated for more than 15 years. He will be incarcerated for the rest of his life. The young man who called himself Johnny Trulove, who drove through the streets of West Los Angeles with money in his pocket and a persona built around being feared and respected, is a middle-aged man in a prison cell. He has had time to think, has had more time to think, in enforced solitude and restriction, than most people get in a lifetime. Whether those years of thought have produced genuine reckoning, genuine accountability, genuine moral transformation, that is something only he can know and something he has not made public in any meaningful way. What we know is that he is in prison, that he will not leave, that the life he is living is bounded by walls and rules, and the perpetual oversight of a system he cannot escape. That whatever Jesse Hollywood might have imagined his future looked like, in the years when he was running and living under a false name on a beach in Brazil, this is not it. And Nick Markowitz is still 15. Still the boy who was taken from a street and buried in the hills. Still the center of a story that continues to matter, continues to be told, continues to demand that the people who hear it sit with the full weight of what happened, and what it cost and who paid the price. There are things we tell ourselves about cases like this one. We tell ourselves that justice was served, that the system worked, eventually, even if it took 9 years and an international fugitive hunt and an extradition from Brazil. We tell ourselves that the verdicts meant something, that Ryan Hoyt on death row and Jesse Hollywood in a prison cell represent an accounting for what was done to Nick Markowitz. And those things are true, incompletely, imperfectly, in the way that all human justice is incomplete and imperfect, but true. The verdicts did mean something. The sentences do represent a consequence. The system did eventually work, but we also have to be honest about what the system cannot do. Cannot bring back a 15-year-old boy. Cannot give Susan Markowitz back the son she lost on a Sunday morning in August 2000. Cannot undo the 3 days of Nick's captivity, the terror he must have felt, the last moments in the hills above Santa Barbara. Cannot reach backward through time and put an adult in the path of a young drug dealer with a dangerous persona and no real understanding of consequence before he made the worst decision of his life. The system can only respond to what has already happened, can only try after the fact to impose accountability and some measure of justice on events that have already permanently altered the lives of everyone they touched. That is what the system did in this case. and it matters, and it is not enough. Both of those things are true simultaneously, and the truth crime that serves its subjects has to hold both of them at once without collapsing one into the other. Justice was served. Nick Markowitz is still gone. Both of those sentences are true. And the distance between them, the gap that no verdict and no sentence and no amount of time can close, is where the real story of what happened in August 2000 continues to live. There is no clean ending to a story like this one. There is no moment where the pieces settle into a shape that makes complete sense of everything, where the why becomes clear enough to satisfy, where the loss transforms into something other than what it is, where the people left behind find the kind of peace that the word resolution implies but never quite delivers. There is only time, the slow, relentless accumulation of days lived in the shadow of something that cannot be undone. Days that Susan Markowitz has gotten up and moved through for more than 2 decades. Days that Jesse Hollywood has spent inside a prison cell, marked off not toward freedom, but simply toward the end of a life that will conclude behind walls. Days that the people who stood at the edges of those 3 days in August 2000 have carried forward into adult lives permanently shaped by what they witnessed and what they chose not to do. Nick Markowitz has not had any of those days. Has not had 2 decades of ordinary mornings and unremarkable afternoons and nights that end in sleep rather than permanence. He has been 15 years old since August 9, 2000, fixed at the age he was when Ryan Hoyt shot him 9 times in the hills above Santa Barbara. Fixed in the photographs that Susan has kept and shared, and held close through every year since. Fixed in the memory of everyone who knew him as the boy who made a room feel lighter just by walking into it. This is what murder takes. Not just a life, though it takes that utterly and irreversibly. It takes the future, takes the decades of becoming. Takes every version of the person that might have existed if the worst thing hadn't happened on a Sunday morning when a 15-year-old boy was simply walking down a street with nowhere particular to be. Nick should have turned 16. Should have turned 20, 30, 40. Should have had the chance to disappoint people and make them proud and change his mind about things and fall in love and have bad days and good ones and all the ordinary texture of a life that was supposed to be his. He didn't get any of it. Jesse James Hollywood will die in prison. This is the legal reality and the human reality both. The outcome of a process that took 9 years and spanned 2 continents and involved enough complexity to fill entire law school curricula. He will grow old inside the California correctional system. We'll watch whatever he can see of the world changing, through whatever limited windows are available to him. We'll carry whatever he carries from August 2000 into the diminishing years of a life that has been reduced to its most essential dimensions: walls, schedules, the complete and permanent absence of freedom. He is in his early 40s now. When he was taken back into custody in Brazil in 2005, he was 24 years old. Still young enough that the face on the wanted posters was recognizable in the man being escorted by federal authorities. Now he has spent more of his adult life inside prison than outside it. The west side of Los Angeles neighborhood where he grew up, where he ran his operation and built his persona and called himself Johnny Truelove, has changed enormously in the years of his incarceration. The culture that produced him, the late 90s California world of suburban drug money and borrowed street aesthetics and the dangerous illusion of being untouchable, has been replaced by something else, something that would be unrecognizable to the 20-year-old who made the decisions he made in the summer of 2000. Jesse Hollywood made those decisions and is serving life without parole for them. The persona he built, the name he gave himself, the entire architecture of a young man who believed consequences were for other people. All of it dismantled by the very consequences he thought he could avoid. Johnny Truelove is a prison number now, a case in California correctional records, a name attached to a crime that defined the limits of what impunity actually means when it finally runs out. Ryan Hoyt remains on California's death row. His appeals have continued through the years since his conviction in 2001. Working their slow way through a system that in California has been functionally suspended around the question of actually carrying out executions for many years. He is middle-aged, has been incarcerated for more than 2 decades. Whether the sentence against him is ultimately carried out, or whether California's ongoing legal and political struggles around capital punishment eventually result in a commutation. Whether Ryan Hoyt dies by the state's hand or grows old and dies of something else inside a cell on death row, he is not free, has not been free, will not be free. He was 20 years old when he drove into the hills above Santa Barbara with a TEF-9 that Jesse Hollywood had given him and dug a grave and shot a 15-year-old boy 9 times. He did it because the person he owed money to told him to. Did it because the world he had placed himself in, the hierarchy he had subordinated himself to, had made refusal feel more dangerous than compliance. He did it because he had been shaped by a world that told him his worth was measured by his usefulness to the person above him, and the person above him needed something done. None of that is an excuse. None of that changes what happened in those hills or who lies in the grave that was dug there. But it is a context. A context that speaks to how violence moves through social structures, how it flows from the person with power toward the person without it, how the person at the bottom of a hierarchy often absorbs the worst consequences of decisions made at the top. Jesse Hollywood is serving life without parole. Ryan Hoyt is on death row. The person who ordered the murder received the lesser sentence. The person who carried it out faces execution. This disparity has been noted, argued over, cited in academic discussions of how the law distributes culpability in cases involving multiple actors. It does not have a comfortable resolution. Jesse Rudge was paroled after serving his sentence and has lived, by most accounts, quietly in the years since his release, out of headlines, out of public view, carrying whatever he carries from those August days into a daily life that Nick Markowitz never had the chance to reach. His freedom is a fact. Not a comfortable fact, not one that resolves easily into anything that feels adequate, but a fact. He is free. Nick is not. The distance between those two sentences is where some of the deepest moral discomfort of this case permanently lies. Graham Presley, who cooperated with prosecutors and received a lighter sentence in exchange, has also been released. He was barely a teenager when the events of August 2000 occurred, present at the edges of what happened, making the same calculations that everyone around him was making about the cost of speaking up versus the cost of going along. He made the wrong calculation then. He cooperated with prosecutors later. Whether the years since have demanded something of him beyond what the legal system required. Whether he has allowed the knowledge of what he participated in to produce genuine reckoning. That is something only he can know. The people who were present at those gatherings where Nick was held, the peripheral figures, the bystanders who saw a 15-year-old boy who was clearly not there by choice and said nothing, did nothing, looked away, have lived their own afterlives in the shadow of those choices. Most of them have not spoken publicly. Most of them have moved through the years since August 2000 in the ordinary anonymity of people whose connection to a famous crime was never quite central enough to make them permanently visible. But they carry it, have to carry it. The knowledge of what they saw and what they chose not to do, pressed into the fabric of every subsequent year of a life that Nick Markowitz did not get to have. This is not a legal consequence. Is not measured in years of incarceration or terms of parole, or any of the formal instruments that the justice system uses to impose accountability. It is the internal kind. The kind that has no official end date and no formal process of completion. Whether any of those people have genuinely reckoned with their share of what happened. Whether the weight of their silence in August 2000 has been allowed to demand something of them, to change them. To produce the kind of moral accounting that might mean the failure of those 3 days is not simply carried but actually transformed into something that is not knowable from the outside. But the question matters. Matters because the silence of bystanders is not a minor feature of this case. It is one of its central mechanisms. Nick Markowitz's captivity lasted 3 days in part because no one who could have helped him chose to. Remember that the next time speaking up costs something. Remember what the alternative cost. Susan Markowitz is still here, still speaking, still doing the work of keeping Nick present in a world that moves relentlessly forward and has 1,000 new tragedies to absorb in the time since August 2000. She has given interviews across 2 decades, has advocated for victims and their families, has sat in courtrooms and faced the people who failed her son and the people who killed him and the legal system that processed their culpability through its grinding machinery over 9 long years, has found ways to honor Nick that extend beyond grief into action, into the building of something meaningful from the materials of something devastating. She has spoken about what it means to carry this kind of loss, has been honest about the way grief does not diminish so much as it integrates, becomes woven into the texture of daily life in a way that is always present, always felt, never resolved into anything that could be called acceptance in the sense of being okay with it. You are never okay with losing your child. You simply find ways to continue being alive in the world that your child is no longer in. You find ways to say his name so that others say it too. You find ways to make his existence mean something beyond the manner of his death. Susan Markowitz has done all of that. Has done it with a persistence and a dignity that deserve to be named clearly and without sentimentality. In a story that has so much failure in it, so many people who made wrong choices, so many systems that didn't catch what they should have caught, so many moments where someone could have acted and didn't, her refusal to let Nick be forgotten is something that cuts against all of it. Not as a redemption of the tragedy. Nothing redeems the tragedy, but as a demonstration of what love looks like when it has no other option but to keep going. What does a story like this one ask of the people who listen to it? It asks something. It has to ask something, or the telling serves no real purpose. True crime at its most honest is not entertainment dressed in the costume of concern. It is the genuine attempt to look at what human beings do to each other, and to ask why, and to sit with the answer even when the answer is uncomfortable. Even when the answer is that the conditions that produced Jesse Hollywood, the privilege without accountability, the consequence-free environments, the cultures of silence still exist. That they exist in different neighborhoods in different forms, but with the same essential logic. That the bystander calculation that left Nick Markowitz in captivity for 3 days, while people look the other way, is a calculation that gets made every day in situations of varying severity. The next time you are in a position where speaking up costs something, where you know something is wrong and the easier path is to look away and tell yourself it isn't your problem. Sit with the memory of those 3 days, of the people who made that calculation over and over, of what their silence cost. It cost a 15-year-old boy his life. Nicholas Markowitz was walking down a street on August 6, 2000. He was 15 years old. He had nowhere particular to be that morning, and the whole long summer day was ahead of him and his life. The full, complicated, ordinary, irreplaceable life that was his was still in the process of becoming whatever it was going to be. He was funny. He was warm. He made people feel comfortable. He was someone's son, someone's friend, someone's little brother. He was 15 years old and the world still owed him decades. It never delivered them. Remember him not as a victim, not as a case number or a film character or a lesson in the dangers of the world. Remember him as Nick. As the boy who was walking down a street on a summer morning and who deserved to keep walking all the way into the life that was waiting for him. He deserved to come home. Thank you for listening tonight. If this story stayed with you, if Nick's memory means something to you, please leave a comment and subscribe to the channel. It genuinely helps these stories reach the people who need to hear them. Good night and stay safe.